Get down on your knees, old man. The training rifle barrel was pressed straight against Elias Ward's temple, in the middle of the training yard, in front of dozens of cadets who were laughing mockingly. Silent. Playing mute to get attention, another one chimed in. The camera zoomed in close. The scoreboard hung suspended. An old civilian man stood in the center of the circle, treated like a cheap test subject, and inside his coat pocket, an old metal object glinted under the sunlight, something no one bothered to ask about, no one bothered to look at. But just a few seconds later, just a single moment, the gun shifted off target. A dry click echoed. The one laughing the loudest collapsed in confusion. The training yard fell dead silent, and then the name was announced. Not for grading. General Elias Ward, United States Marine Corps, retired. At that moment, who was truly being evaluated? If you were that cadet, would you keep hiding behind proper procedure, or would you dare to stand up when power is abused? If you were the one holding the gun, would you actually look, or only know how to give orders? Comment your choice. Follow and subscribe to the channel, because this is not just a story. It is the kind of thing that makes an entire system bow its head. The North Ridge Military Police Academy sat atop a barren hill, where the wind blew relentlessly through rows of barbed wire fences, carrying a sharp sound, like metal scraping against skin. From a distance, it looked like an ordinary training facility. Still, anyone who ever stepped through its gates understood that it operated like a crushing machine, one where morality did not disappear, but was compressed, flattened, and then rearranged under concepts known as curriculum. At North Ridge, violence was never named outright. It was wrapped in the language of control, discipline, and procedure. The final evaluation day was always the day that the machine ran at full capacity. The morning began under harsh sunlight, beating straight down onto the wide, empty training ground. Surveillance cameras were mounted high above, their glossy black lenses rotating slowly, silently recording every movement. The wind shrieked through the barbed wire, carrying dust and the smell of heated metal. From the loudspeakers, a familiar voice rang out, steady and cold. Safety and control are everything. One beat too slow is failure. The statement was not broadcast to encourage, but to set the rhythm, a rhythm everyone had to follow if they did not want to be eliminated. The cadets assembled in a curved formation on the field. Their white uniforms made them look nearly indistinguishable, but their eyes told a different story. Some held eagerness, some tension, and others, the confidence of those accustomed to standing at the top. They stood there, shoulders squared, hands placed precisely, like a hunting formation waiting for a signal. Low whispers rippled briefly, then died out when the supervising officer signaled the start. An elderly man was led to the center of the field. He walked slowly, his posture slightly bent with age, holding a small cloth bag in his hand. Elias Ward stood there, completely separated from the ring of white uniforms surrounding him. His difference was not only his age, but the way he occupied the space, as if he did not belong to the script prepared for this day. A few cadets glanced at one another, the corners of their mouths curling into poorly concealed smiles. This old man is supposed to be under pressure. One cadet laughed openly, making no effort to lower his voice. The remark carried far enough for those nearby to hear, and a few more laughs quickly followed. The laughter was not joyful. It was a collective reflex, the fastest way to assert one's position from within the safety of the circle. Elias Ward did not react. He stood still, eyes fixed straight ahead. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing a calm so complete it unsettled those watching. There was no sign of confusion, no overt resistance, only a stillness that did not align with what this training ground expected. Inside the glass control room above, a supervising officer leaned over a notebook. The pen paused for a brief beat, then moved. Subject exhibits delayed response. The line was written quickly, without emotion. It was enough to turn composure into a point of concern. No one noted that the man had shown no threatening behavior, no resistance whatsoever. Elias stood in the middle of the field, isolated like a misplaced punctuation mark. No one asked who he was, where he came from, or why he was here. Those questions fell outside the scope of the evaluation. What mattered was reaction, speed, and control. The human being in front of them was merely a variable in the scenario. The wind grew stronger, lifting fine dust into the air. Sunlight cast Elias's shadow long across the ground. The cadets continued to stare, some with curiosity, others with open contempt. The atmosphere began to shift, subtly but unmistakably. This was no longer just training. A fragile boundary was being nudged out of alignment. From skill assessment to a test of dignity, the loudspeakers fell silent, leaving the training yard to run on the rhythm of gazes and expectations alone. One cadet stepped slightly forward, then stopped, as if waiting for his name to be called. The supervising officers exchanged looks behind the glass, tracking the smallest movements. Everything was being recorded, but not everything was being seen the same way. Elias Ward breathed evenly, his gaze unwavering. He did not know the name of the person who would approach him, and perhaps he did not need to. To him, this moment was not a beginning, but a point of intersection where the things long dismissed were about to surface. From the line of cadets, a name was called out, firm and clear. Caleb Harlan, the man who carried that name, stepped forward, his stride confident, as if accustomed to being chosen. All eyes immediately followed him. On the training ground, the air tightened for a brief instant, just long enough to signal that the machine's rotation had shifted into a different speed. Caleb Harlan stepped out from the line of trainees with the familiar gait of someone whose name had been called many times before. At North Ridge, that name required no lengthy introduction. He was the one at the top of the score rankings, the living example of what the academy aimed to produce. Strong physical conditioning, fast reflexes, clear articulation. In front of the camera, everything about Caleb fit perfectly into the celebrated mold. As he moved toward Elias Ward, he did not feel as though he was facing a human being, but rather approaching a test for which the answers were already known. Caleb stopped at an appropriate distance, lightly adjusting his collar in an almost unconscious gesture. He lifted his head, squared his shoulders, and then spoke in a firm voice. "Stand still, hands up." The command rang clearly across the yard, neither excessive in emotion nor lacking in force. It was the voice of someone accustomed to giving orders and accustomed to being obeyed. Before looking at Elias, Caleb glanced straight at the camera, only a brief beat, but enough for the lens to capture his confident face. At Northridge, the camera did not merely record, it was both witness and measuring stick. Caleb understood that, and he knew how to place himself in the frame at the right moment. He turned back to face Elias Ward, his eyes quickly assessing him from head to toe. Name, purpose for being here. Caleb spoke evenly, as though reciting lines straight from the training manual. Each word was delivered precisely, on cue, carrying no real interrogative tone. To him, this was merely a procedure to move on to the next step. Elias Ward lifted his head. The movement was slow and deliberate, without avoidance. His gaze met Caleb's for a brief moment. His lips moved slightly, then stopped. The silence stretched longer than the familiar beat, long enough for Caleb to begin feeling uneasy. Caleb waited. 1 second, then another. That silence was not part of the script he had memorized. The corner of his mouth curled with a hint of contempt. "Playing mute," he said, without lowering his voice. The question was not meant to seek an answer, but to assert dominance. Laughter broke out from the line of trainees behind him, spreading quickly like a reflex. It was the laughter of agreement, of the comfort of standing on the same side. A few nodded, some pointed, as if Elias's silence alone were sufficient proof to conclude. Inside the glass room, a supervising officer bent down and added a note to the logbook. Non-compliant. Potential risk. The words appeared quickly, neatly, without the need for explanation. They turned silence into a warning sign, turned a man standing still into a possible threat. No one noted that Elias had not committed any act of resistance. Caleb sensed that invisible support. He shifted slightly to the side, forming an angled approach, narrowing the space between himself and Elias. "Do you hear me?" he asked, his voice lowered as if feigning patience. "Or do I need to repeat myself?" Elias Ward remained motionless. His gaze did not change, neither challenging nor evasive. That very calm unsettled Caleb. He was used to fear, used to hurried reactions. Standing before him, this elderly man appeared as though he had not been drawn into the rhythm Caleb was imposing. "This is an evaluation," Caleb continued, his voice growing more rigid. "Every second that passes is being recorded. Cooperate, and things will go faster." He glanced toward the camera, then back again, as if reminding Elias that a system stood behind him. A trainee behind him nudged the person next to them. "He's really committing to the act." The remark drew a few quiet laughs, but they were no longer as loud as before. Some began to pay closer attention, not merely out of curiosity, but because something felt less smooth than they had expected. Caleb repeated the command. "Name," he said, placing more emphasis on it. "What is your name?" His voice no longer carried the tone of reciting a script, but shifted into coercion. He stepped forward half a pace, the distance between them narrowing until their breaths could almost meet. Elias Ward blinked, very lightly. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Another pause appeared, shorter, but heavier. To the crowd, this slowness began to resemble provocation. They were accustomed to orders being answered immediately. "What do you think you're doing?" Caleb asked sharply. Do you think this is a place for you to test me? He moved closer, fully violating the safe distance the manual often mentioned, but that was rarely respected when emotions ran high. Inside the glass room, the supervising officers lifted their heads from the screens. One leaned toward a colleague. He's accelerating it, the other replied, eyes fixed on the image. As long as he keeps it under control. Caleb heard the laughter behind him fade. The pressure shifted from the crowd onto himself. He did not like that sensation. Do you hear me? He said, each word heavier. Or do you want me to treat this silence as resistance? Elias Ward looked straight at Caleb. That gaze did not avoid him, but it also carried no open defiance. It resembled a steady presence, forcing Caleb to confront his own actions. Answer, Caleb said, his voice low but harsh. Right now. He stepped forward once more. The distance no longer professional, but personal domination. It was the moment when the boundary began to blur. A few trainees exchanged looks, no longer laughing. They realized the situation was slipping out of its familiar rhythm, yet no one spoke up. They stood there, held in place by habit, obedience, and a cold curiosity. Caleb stepped even closer, completely breaching the safe distance. In that moment, under the harsh sunlight, and the many eyes fixed on the center of the training yard, the escalation had begun, even though no one had yet named it. The distance between Caleb Harlan and Elias Ward was now uncomfortably thin. Sunlight poured straight down onto the training field, making the air shimmer like a pane of glass heated to its limit. Caleb stood facing the old man, acutely aware of each breath compressing inside his chest. Elias's prolonged silence was no longer a minor detail in an evaluation. It was beginning to wound the ego of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Can you hear me? Answer, Caleb snarled, each word snapping out heavy and sharp. His voice rang across the field, cutting through even the wind, as a final order slammed onto the table. To him, this was not merely a question but an assertion that control still rested in his hands. Elias Ward looked straight at Caleb. His gaze was steady and deep, like the bottom of an old well that reflected no light. There was no sign of fear, nor any hint of defiance. That very calmness forced Caleb into a position where he felt he had even more to prove. Behind them, one trainee nudged another's shoulder and whispered loudly enough for several people to hear, "He's really committing to the act." The remark drew a few scattered laughs, the familiar kind that surfaced whenever someone believed the situation was firmly under control. The crowd needed that laughter to reassure themselves that they were standing on the stronger side. Caleb felt the eyes on his back, felt the camera pointed straight at him. He understood that hesitation at this moment would be read as weakness. His hand slid down to his belt, the movement decisive and smooth, as if cut straight out of a recruitment video. The orange training pistol appeared, its bright plastic stark under the sunlight, instantly changing the atmosphere on the field. A few trainees held their breath, others tilted their heads, watching more intently. The presence of a weapon always brought a sense of certainty, as if everything had just been pulled back onto a familiar track. "One last time," Caleb said, lowering his voice and enunciating deliberately so the camera would capture every sound. "Do you have any sharp objects?" The question was delivered like a formality, but his eyes had changed tighter, more resolute. This was no longer about gathering information. It was about applying pressure to force a reaction. Elias Ward shook his head. The motion was slow and clear, carrying no hint of evasion. As he stood still, the sunlight slanted across him, and the edge of his old jacket pocket slipped open for a very brief moment. A line of metal flashed under the sun, then vanished. The instant passed so quickly that only those who were truly watching noticed it. Caleb did not look down. His focus was entirely on maintaining the upper hand. He believed he had enough information, that everything necessary was already under control. "Good," he said curtly, lifting the pistol slightly higher. He lowered his voice even further, almost to a whisper, letting the lens capture his cold composure. "Kneel." The command rang out clearly, needing no repetition. It was the order used to end situations, to stamp victory in place. Laughter rippled from the line of trainees, not loud but spreading easily. It was the laughter that cheered the one who is winning, the familiar sound whenever power is fully asserted. A few people nodded, as though witnessing a textbook handling of the situation. Elias Ward did not kneel. He remained standing, his gaze still fixed on Caleb. That stillness caused a few laughs to falter. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "You're making this worse," he snapped. "Every second that passes, you're pushing yourself deeper into trouble." He stepped closer, the muzzle lifting another fraction. The distance between the barrel and Elias's head was now very small. One trainee nearby swallowed hard. Another turned away, but no one spoke. You think this is a game, Caleb continued. You think you have the right to stay silent here. He did not wait for an answer. He needed to end the situation in a way that left no room for doubt about himself. Elias Ward looked straight ahead, his voice hoarse but clear. Son, he said slowly, if you need a gun to prove you're strong, you already lost before you pulled it out. The words fell softly, but they were enough to make several people behind them flinch. The air froze. The laughter vanished completely. Caleb felt heat rush through his blood, but he restrained himself, reminding himself that he was following procedure. Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice rising. Do you forget where you're standing? He pushed the muzzle even closer. The orange plastic nearly touched skin. The sunlight reflected off it, making it brutally conspicuous. In front of the entire unit, the line between control and threat was crossed by a step no one named. The training field was silent. The camera kept rolling. There was no order to stop, no signal of intervention. Everything unfolded under the stark light of evaluation day. If you argue up to this point, ask yourself, is silence the wrongdoing, or is it the one holding the gun who has crossed the line? Your answer may differ from those standing on that field. Leave your comment and keep following, because the moment the muzzle presses close to Elias Ward's temple, in front of the entire unit, is only the beginning of a reversal no one saw coming. The orange training gun barrel was pressed against Elias Ward's temple, close enough for everyone to see every small movement of the hand holding it. Caleb Harlan ground his teeth, his voice snapping out tight and sharp. You think you have the right to stay silent? The question sounded like an accusation, but it was also a way of reassuring himself, because he needed to believe he was doing the right thing, that this was the next legitimate step in the procedure. Elias stood still. His aged frame was impossibly straight, like a pillar planted in the middle of the yard. His eyes never left Caleb, calm and deep, making the distance between the two men feel strange. This was no longer the distance between the one who gives orders and the one who receives them, but the distance between two different understandings of power. One relied on the gun barrel and the permission of the system. The other relied on the composure of someone who had already crossed far worse boundaries. Inside the glass room, a line of text appeared on the surveillance monitor, entered by fingers more accustomed to typing than to facing another human being. The situation has been controlled. The words stood there, motionless and cold, like a verdict. They turned the moment of a gun barrel touching the head of an unresisting man into an approved state. At Northridge, language had the power to recolor reality that quickly. Out on the yard, a trainee swallowed hard. The smile that had been on his lips moments earlier faded, leaving behind an unmistakable look of confusion. He glanced at the person beside him, as if seeking confirmation that everything was still fine, that this was still just an exam, but the answering gaze slid away. The earlier laughter had disappeared, replaced by a heavy silence, a silence that no longer carried mockery but smelled of worry. Caleb felt the shift. He knew he was standing on the edge of something, but he did not step back. Stepping back now would be understood as hesitation, and hesitation at Northridge was synonymous with failure. He leaned in closer, lowered his voice, whispering, each word hissing through clenched teeth. I pull the trigger, and it's over. The words were spoken less to threaten Elias than to reassure himself, to affirm that he was in control, that everything was in his hands. Elias Ward heard him clearly. He did not flinch, nor did he frown. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse but clear, carrying far enough to spread through the nearby space. If you need a gun to prove you're strong, you've already lost. The statement carried no challenge and no intention to instruct. It sounded like a cold observation drawn from experience, and that very simplicity made it unsettling. The air in the yard froze. The trainees standing around the perimeter looked at one another, then back toward the glass room. A few waited for the loudspeaker to intervene, for an order to stop, for a sign that the boundary had been defined, but nothing happened. The camera kept recording, and the screen kept displaying the controlled status. The silence of the system at that moment weighed more heavily than any words. Caleb tightened his grip on the gun. He felt his heart rate accelerate, but he called it focus. Who do you think you are to lecture me? He said, his voice rising slightly. You are in the training zone. You are the subject. I am the one responsible. He emphasized the final words, as if naming the roles would automatically reinforce his authority. Elias met his gaze, his expression unchanged. Responsibility doesn't lie in the gun barrel, he replied, his voice still even. It lies in how you use it. The answer made a few people standing nearby jolt. They were not used to hearing sentences like that on a training ground, where language was usually cut short to serve commands. A supervising officer in the glass room lifted his head from his notebook. His eyes settled on the screen, where the image of Caleb and Elias filled the entire frame. He said nothing, but his brows drew together slightly. A colleague beside him leaned over and whispered, "Still okay," the other replied, slowly. "According to the assessment, okay." Those two words closed the exchange. Like a door. In the yard, Caleb felt his confidence beginning to fracture, not because Elias resisted, but because he did nothing at all. That calmness made Caleb's actions look rougher, more exposed. He tried to regain the initiative by repeating the command. "Kneel," he said, his voice growing hoarse. "I won't repeat it." Elias did not kneel. He stood there, his eyes never leaving Caleb. This silence was no longer personal. It spread outward, covering the entire yard. The trainees who had earlier gone along with it began to feel themselves pulled into a situation they were not mentally prepared for. They realized they were not just spectators. They were part of the context that was allowing this to happen. Caleb pushed the gun barrel closer until it touched skin. That moment stretched long enough for a few people to turn their faces away. One trainee whispered, his voice trembling, "Stop," but the words dissolved into the air, failing to reach anyone with the power to decide. Elias exhaled softly, then spoke lowly, "You're turning an evaluation exercise into something else." He did not need to name that thing. Everyone listening understood, "And you're calling it control." Caleb let out a short laugh, the sound dry and brittle. "This is control," he replied. "The system says so." He glanced toward the camera, as if searching for confirmation. "You see that?" he said louder, directing his words toward the glass room. "I have the situation under control." Inside the glass room, the line of text remained unchanged. "The situation has been controlled." It appeared like a protective charm, covering everything unfolding below. But at the same time, the eyes of several supervising officers began to change. They saw the misalignment between the words and the image, between terminology and reality. One of them set his pen down and stopped writing. Caleb sensed the crowd slowing. He knew that if this dragged on any longer, things might slip out of his grasp. He lowered the gun barrel slightly, just enough that it no longer touched skin, but still close enough to maintain pressure. "The drill is over," he said, his voice trying to recover its earlier smoothness. "The subject has been controlled." The loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing the end of the evaluation round. That familiar sound cut through the tension like a sudden break. A few trainees exhaled in relief. Others remained frozen, unsure how to react. Caleb stepped back half a pace, drew the gun in, and tried to maintain an air of composure. He turned his back and walked away, as if everything were finished. Elias Ward remained standing there for one more beat. He watched Caleb go, his gaze unwavering, not with resentment, but with a cold attentiveness. That look carried no promise, but it made the observers feel that the story was not over. When Elias finally turned away, the training yard seemed to breathe out, yet the afterimage of the moment still hung in the air, unwilling to dissipate. The exercise ended exactly according to procedure. Scores would be recorded, comments would be stamped and filed, but Elias's eyes did not leave Caleb as the two separated, and in that gaze was something the words on the screen could not erase, that there are actions which, no matter what they are called, remain violence, and that their cost has never disappeared simply because someone chose to call them by another name. The afternoon at North Ridge carried a different kind of light. The sun was no longer as harsh as it had been in the morning, yet the heat still hovered over the training ground, clinging to the skin and making every movement feel heavy. After the first drill session, the trainees had dispersed for a short break, but the atmosphere had not softened at all. What had just happened still lingered in their eyes, in the small whispered remarks, in the sense that some boundary had been touched, even though no one had yet named it. The sound of steady footsteps echoed from the main entrance to the field. The trainees immediately snapped back into formation, reflexes sharpened by months of training. General Rock appeared in the afternoon sunlight, tall frame, squared shoulders, his stride slow but firm. He needed no introduction. His presence alone was enough to quiet the training ground. Half-finished conversations stopped abruptly, and all eyes turned in a single direction. Rock halted at the edge of the field, swept his gaze across the rows of trainees, then spoke, slowly and clearly, each word placed with intention. "I do not grade you on slogans. I grade you on how you treat people." The sentence was not loud, nor threatening, but it carried a weight that made many unconsciously straighten their backs. For some trainees, it was a reminder. For others, It was a formulaic line, the kind that often appeared in debriefings and was quickly forgotten once the next evaluation began. At the signal, the civilian subjects were brought back onto the field for the debrief and reassessment of the scenario. Elias Ward stepped out to the center of the field once again. He was the same as before, slow-moving, steady-eyed, with a Swithmall cloth bag in his hand. Nothing about him had changed since the morning, and it was precisely that lack of change that made a few trainees feel uncomfortable, as if he had stepped out of the role they had assigned to him and now returned with a presence that was hard to define. Caleb Harlan stood in the line of trainees, his eyes lighting up when he saw Elias. The corner of his mouth curled into a familiar smirk. "That old man again," he said, not lowering his voice, loud enough for those around him to hear. A few laughs broke out, weaker than in the morning, but still carrying a sense of agreement. Caleb stepped forward half a pace, as if he had been invited. "Don't worry," he continued, turning slightly toward the other trainees, then glancing at General Rock. "I handled it by the book." His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed he had done everything right according to the manual. In Caleb's mind, the morning had ended with the drill being marked as controlled. To him, that was proof enough. Caleb looked at Elias, his gaze sweeping from head to toe as if reassessing a familiar object. "Or do you want to kneel in front of the whole field?" he said, his tone tinged with mockery, as though recalling an old situation to reassert his position. "This time the higher-ups are here, so follow proper procedure." A few trainees glanced toward General Rock, waiting for a reaction, but Rock remained still, his eyes unblinking, fixed straight ahead. He did not intervene, nor did he interrupt. His silence was not agreement, but a form of deep observation, one that made the person in front of him easily mistake it for permission to continue. Elias Ward looked at Caleb, his expression unchanged. When he spoke, his voice was even and low, neither raised nor lowered. "Do what you think is right." The words were gentle, yet they created an uneasy void. They neither challenged nor argued, but placed the full responsibility back onto Caleb, like a mirror set up directly in front of him. Caleb faltered for a very brief beat. He was not accustomed to that kind of response. He was used to fear, to exaggerated reactions, to pleas or arguments. Elias's calm made him feel as though he were losing the rhythm of control he believed he had firmly in hand. But the sensation passed quickly. He reassured himself that this was still the training ground, that he was still the one responsible for handling the situation. "Did you hear me?" Caleb said, his voice slightly higher, as if pulling attention back to himself. "This is an evaluation. If you cooperate, everything will be quick and clean." He flicked a glance toward the camera, then toward General Rock, as if searching for confirmation. "We are following the procedure." Rock was still there. His gaze lingered on Caleb a moment longer, then shifted to Elias. There was no nod, and no shake of the head, only a prolonged silence, long enough to make others feel as though they were standing under a harsh spotlight. Caleb took a breath, his hand sliding down to his belt. The motion was so familiar it was almost unconscious. The orange training pistol appeared again, this time a bit slower than in the morning, as if he wanted everyone to see each movement clearly. A few trainees nearby frowned. They were beginning to realize that this repetition was no longer simply a drill. "You will comply," Caleb said, his voice rigid. "Hands up." He raised the pistol, keeping it at a distance he believed was safe, but close enough to apply pressure. "Don't make this more complicated." Elias Ward did not react immediately. He stood there, looking at Caleb, then briefly glanced at General Rock for a very short moment. That look carried no plea for help, but rather resembled a confirmation that the highest authority present was witnessing everything. When Elias turned his gaze back to Caleb, he spoke slowly. "You are choosing this way." Caleb frowned. "What way?" he snapped. "The right way." He stepped forward, closing the distance, as if to crush any doubt. "Don't test my patience." Rock remained right there, unmoving. His eyes did not blink, did not leave the two men. His presence made the situation heavier, because it stripped away the excuse that things were happening beyond the control of superiors. Everything was unfolding clearly, right in front of him. Caleb raised the pistol higher, the afternoon sunlight reflecting off the orange plastic, making it stand out in the middle of the field. A few trainees held their breath. Someone whispered, "Is he really going to do it?" The question went unanswered. Elias Ward shifted slightly. It was a very small movement, almost insignificant, just enough to change his stance a little. That half step was slow, not evasive, but more like a natural adjustment, as though he were simply avoiding a beam of sunlight shining directly into his eyes. That small movement, in the tense context, took on a different meaning. It shattered the image of immobility that Caleb had come to equate with weakness. It also disrupted the rhythm Caleb was trying to impose. In that moment, Caleb felt himself pulled off his familiar trajectory, though he did not yet understand why. The training ground seemed to hold its breath. Elias Ward's half-step hung suspended in the air, opening up a possibility no one dared to name, and everyone realized that this afternoon's return to the testing ground would not end the same way as the morning, because even the smallest movement was enough to shake what was called control. The very small half-step Elias Ward had just completed ended, and then everything happened so fast that many people only understood it after the sound had already echoed. Caleb Harlan still held the training pistol at pressure range, his gaze locked forward, believing he had the advantage. At that exact moment, Elias's wrist turned slightly, a clean and precise movement, as if it had been calculated in advance. The barrel shifted off axis, the force was redirected, and Caleb's gun hand lost its point of support in a brief instant. The dry sound of plastic striking the ground rang out, clack, clear enough for the entire training field to hear. The gun hit the ground, rolled a short distance, then stopped. No one had time to cry out. The trainees standing closest widened their eyes. A few instinctively stepped back half a step, as if they had just witnessed something not included in the curriculum. Caleb froze for a fraction of a second. Then his reflexes flared as if he had been publicly insulted. He lunged forward, his voice breaking. "You cheated." The shout carried anger and humiliation rather than his initial confidence. He tried to grab Elias, but the man's hand had already locked onto the joint, applying just enough force to keep Caleb still, enough to make him understand that he had lost the upper hand. "You closed in at the wrong angle," Elias said, his voice low and even, as if pointing out a technical mistake during a training session. There was no boastfulness, no provocation. "You positioned the barrel in a way that made it easy for your force to be redirected." The statement rang out clearly, loud enough for those nearby to hear, loud enough for Caleb's humiliation to become obvious. Caleb yanked hard, his face flushed dark red, sweat bursting out across his forehead. "Who do you think you are, daring to make me lose face?" he yelled, his eyes darting toward General Rock, toward the supervising officers, as if searching for support. "You didn't follow procedure. You ruined my evaluation." Elias released his grip and stepped back a beat, no longer restraining Caleb. He stood straight, facing him, his voice still unhurried. "Procedure does not forbid you from observing," he said. "It just does not protect you when you forget to do so." The response was not aimed at the crowd, yet the crowd still heard it. A few trainees murmured, questions slipping out on their breath. "What's with that old guy? Was that real just now?" He got disarmed. The morning excitement had vanished, replaced by a strange unease, as people realized that what they believed to be certain could collapse with a single small movement. General Rock stepped forward one pace. His movement was not hurried, but it was enough to draw every eye. His voice rang out, deep and solid, like a layer of ice settling over the entire field. Based on his experience, the sentence was brief, without further explanation, yet it cut off every reaction rising in others' throats. Caleb spun around. "Sir," he interfered without authorization, he said, his voice still high. "He made me lose control of the situation." He tried to regain his footing, adjusted his breathing, as if saying the right words could return everything to its former place. Rock did not look at Caleb right away. He turned toward the line of trainees, his gaze sweeping across each tense face. "You are looking at a man," Rock said slowly, each word placed clearly, "without whom many of us would not be alive to wear this uniform." The air seemed to thicken. A few trainees straightened unconsciously, others held their breath. Elias Ward stood still, showing no reaction to the introduction. He did not bow his head, nor did he turn away. To him, this was not a moment that required validation, but for those around him, Rock's words opened a vast space, where the image of an old target subject had just been replaced by something entirely different. Rock raised his hand in a military salute. The gesture was decisive, solemn, allowing no misunderstanding. "General Elias Ward, United States Marine Corps, retired." The title echoed across the training field, which only minutes earlier had been filled with laughter and commands. It landed like a heavy object, pressing all other sounds into silence. A wave of silence swept through the ranks of trainees. Those who had laughed now stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Elias, with belated realization. A few swallowed hard, others lowered their heads. The supervising officers in the glass room stopped writing, the screens still displaying the training field, but no one was paying attention to the evaluation formation lines anymore. Caleb stood in the middle of the field, his hands trembling slightly. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. His face shifted from flushed red to pale. Legend or whatever, he muttered, trying to recover a firm tone. There are still procedures here. The words sounded weak, like a final thread he was clinging to. Elias looked at Caleb, his eyes carrying no contempt. Correct, he said calmly. And precisely because there are procedures, they must not be used as a license to humiliate someone who is not resisting. He turned slightly toward the camera, as if aware that what had just happened would be reviewed, analyzed, dissected. Do you think violence becomes clean just because it is scored? No one answered. The trainees stood there, one by one, realizing that they had just witnessed an undeniable reversal, not through brute strength, but through technique, timing, and a presence they had dismissed from the start. General Rock lowered his hand. Stop here, he said. The drill is over. But the way he spoke made everyone understand that this was not over. He turned to the supervising officers. Bring all the footage to the conference room. Now, Elias Ward remained still for another beat, then turned away. He did not look back at the crowd, nor did he seek recognition. For him, what needed to be done was finished, at least the first part, but the eyes of those remaining followed him, carrying a change difficult to name, as if a curtain had just been pulled aside, revealing another stage, where questions of power and responsibility could no longer be avoided. If you had been standing on that field, would you have apologized or tried to make excuses like Caleb? That choice, however small, says more than any test ever could. Leave your comment and follow the next part, because from the moment the name Elias Ward was spoken aloud, everything at Northridge had only just begun to collapse. A silence heavy as stone pressed down over the entire academy. Not the silence of an ending, but the silence that opens questions no one is comfortable ignoring anymore. The moment the name Elias Ward was announced, the training yard fell into a state that was difficult to define. It was not the empty silence that follows the end of a drill, but a heavy silence that comes when awareness lags behind action. The cadets stood in formation, their eyes still fixed on the elderly man who had just been addressed by a title they never expected. No one spoke, yet in each mind, the images of the morning and afternoon were replaying, rearranged into a new order. Caleb Harlan stood at the center of that open space, chest rising and falling, jaw clenched. He froze for exactly one beat, long enough for the truth to land. Then he let out a harsh laugh, dry and sharp, as if trying to tear through the air. So what if he's a legend? Caleb said, his voice higher than usual. There are procedures here. Everyone has to follow them. He spoke quickly, as if afraid that if he paused, he might hear the emptiness in his own argument. A few cadets flinched. One of them glanced sideways, then turned his head away, avoiding General Rock's gaze. That avoidance was not born of direct fear, but of a vague shame, the realization that they had just mocked someone the military system itself had long regarded as a symbol. The silence spread, and no one dared to echo Caleb the way they had before. Elias Ward stood facing him, posture straight, expression calm. He did not react to the harsh laughter, not because it offended him, but because he had heard it too many times, in too many different contexts. When he spoke, his voice was low and clear, each word placed deliberately. Procedure is not a license to humiliate someone who does not resist. The sentence carried across the field without emphasis, yet it was enough for those listening to understand that the center of gravity had shifted. Caleb curled his lip. Are you lecturing me? He snapped. You're outside the system now. What do you know about the pressure here? He raised his hand, pointing around the yard, at the line of cadets, toward the cameras. We're graded every second. We have to do exactly what we're taught. Yes, Elias replied, without raising his voice, and that is precisely why I am standing here. He looked straight at Caleb, his eyes devoid of pity. I stand outside so I can see what you miss. The words caused several cadets to lower their heads unconsciously, not because they knew exactly where they were wrong, but because they sensed a void in the way they had been conditioned to act. Caleb shook his head, letting out a short, humorless laugh. That sounds nice, he said, but this isn't your battlefield anymore. Here, we have standards, we have procedures, we have evaluations. He stressed each word, as if repetition would make them more solid. You can't just walk in and tear everything apart because of a name. Elias did not answer immediately. He looked around the training yard at the tense young faces, at the cameras still trained on the center, at the glass room where the supervising officers sat. I am not tearing anything apart, he said. After a brief pause, I am only exposing it. The sentence was short, but it tightened the air even further. The cameras kept rolling, No one ordered them shut off. The tiny indicator lights on their housings continued to blink steadily, a reminder that everything was being recorded, every word, every expression. At this point, the cameras were no longer tools of evaluation. They had become witnesses, and that realization began to make several supervising officers behind the glass uncomfortable. Caleb spun toward General Rock. "Sir," he said, forcing his voice into formal lines. "This man disrupted the examination. He interfered unlawfully with our evaluation procedure." He swallowed, then continued more quickly. "I request that this be handled according to regulations." Rock did not respond right away. He stood there, his gaze resting on Caleb, then shifting to Elias, then sweeping across the cadet line. His slowness only made Caleb more restless. He was accustomed to quick responses, to clear commands, not to prolonged silences. "Which regulation?" Rock asked at last. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the field. Caleb hesitated for a beat. "The regulation concerning non-compliant subjects," he replied. He failed to follow orders, creating a safety risk. The words came smoothly, as though recited from memory. Rock nodded slightly, then asked, "And what risk is that?" The question was simple, yet it forced Caleb to stop and think. He opened his mouth, then closed it. "Searching, instability," he said finally. "The potential for escalation." "Escalation?" How Rock asked, his eyes never leaving him. Caleb frowned. "Sir, if not controlled immediately, the subject could." He stopped, realizing he was repeating vague phrases. He took a deep breath. "Could become dangerous," Elias interjected, his tone even. Dangerous to whom? He did not look at Caleb, but straight at Rock. To the unarmed man, or to the one holding the gun? The question landed heavily, drawing a sharp intake of breath from several cadets. Caleb turned back, voice edged with anger. "You're redirecting the narrative." He pointed at Elias. "You are the subject of our examination. You have no right to question us." Elias met his gaze. "And do you have the right to humiliate someone simply because you are being graded?" The question was delivered calmly, yet it lingered in the air, impossible to dismiss. A cadet at the far end of the line turned his body away completely, unable to endure Rock's scanning gaze. Another bit his lip, eyes fixed on the ground. The tension no longer came from the threat of physical violence, but from familiar norms being called into question. Rock took half a step forward. "That's enough," he said, his voice low. "This examination is no longer about scores." He turned to the supervising officers, his look decisive. "Stop the test. Bring all recordings to the conference room." The words fell like a stamped order. Inside the glass room, the supervising officers exchanged looks, then nodded. One reached out to shut down the large display on the field, though the cameras themselves kept recording. Caleb stood frozen, lips pressed tight. He realized the battlefield had shifted, and this time, he was no longer in a position to control the tempo. Elias Ward said nothing more. He stood there, his gaze sweeping across the training yard one last time, as if committing every face and every expression to memory. The silence after the legend was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of a question that had been asked and could not be taken back. The internal meeting room of North Ridge was located behind the one-way glass wall that had long looked down upon the training yard. This was a place accustomed to observing without being observed, to recording without needing to explain. That afternoon, the supervising officers and instructors took their seats in an unusual atmosphere. No one spoke loudly, no one joked. Chairs were pulled back, the soft scraping sound ringing more clearly than usual, as if the room itself were tightening, in anticipation of what was about to unfold. The large screen lit up. The first image that appeared was the afternoon training yard, filmed from a high angle. Caleb Harlan stood at the center of the frame, posture straight, training firearm in hand. Elias Ward stood opposite him, composed. A supervising officer cleared his throat lightly, then read aloud the evaluation line that had already been entered into the system. Model suppression. The voice was even and neutral, as if reciting a conclusion settled long ago. Elias Ward sat at the head of the table, both hands resting on the wooden surface, listening. He lifted his head, eyes directed at the screen. Model, for whom he asked, his voice not loud, but firm enough to cut across the reading. The question caused several people in the room to shift in their chairs. No one answered immediately. The text on the screen remained there, like an assertion beyond dispute. An older instructor, who had taught at North Ridge for more than 2 decades, frowned. "You are making too much of this," he said, irritation evident in his voice. "This is training. Pressure is part of it. If we dissect every detail, We won't be able to train anyone. Elias turned toward him, his expression calm. No, he replied slowly. I am calling it by its proper name. He pointed toward the screen. You call that suppression. I call it a threat. The statement caused the air in the room to sink. A few people glanced at one another, as if weighing which side to stand on. The screen shifted. The video was slowed down. Each frame appeared more clearly every step forward by Caleb, every tilt of his body, every narrowing of distance. When the barrel of the gun moved close to Elias's head, the image froze in an extended moment. The light reflected off the bright orange plastic was impossible to ignore. No one spoke. A supervising officer lowered his gaze to his notebook, then looked up again, as if searching for a familiar line of annotation. There is no category that records threatening behavior, someone said quietly, almost in a whisper. He flipped through several pages of the digital file, only a note indicating situation control. Caleb Harlan sat along one side of the table, his fingers interlaced. Since entering the room, he had barely spoken. His eyes stayed fixed on the screen, then flicked toward Elias, then turned away again. The ground beneath his feet was beginning to shift in a way he had never experienced. On the training yard, everything happened quickly. Laughter, commands, loudspeakers. In this room, everything was slowed down, every small detail magnified. You see, Caleb spoke up, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no threat. I did exactly what I was taught. Distance, posture, command, voice. All of it stayed within the safety framework. His speech quickened at the end, as if he feared being interrupted. Elias turned to look at Caleb. A safety framework for whom, he asked? For the one holding the gun, or for the one standing in front of the barrel? The question was not meant to accuse an individual, but to expose an assumption that had existed for far too long. Several people in the room frowned slightly. They realized the question could not be answered easily with a training manual. The older instructor shook his head. You're looking at this through the lens of the past, he said. Times have changed. We train to handle the worst-case scenario. He emphasized the word train, as though it were a shield. I have also faced the worst-case scenario, Elias replied, his tone unchanged, and that is precisely why I know where the boundary lies. He gestured toward the screen. When the person in front of you does not resist, every additional step forward must be explained. Here, there is no explanation, only scores. The screen continued to play. The video shifted to the angle from inside the glass room. The evaluation text appeared in the corner, cold and concise. The situation has been controlled. A young supervising officer bit his lip, staring at that line longer than necessary. We rely on criteria, he said, his voice revealing discomfort. If we don't, we'll be accused of bias. Which criteria allow you to ignore the silence of a person who is not resisting? Elias asked. He did not sound accusatory, but the question forced the listener to think. You record delayed response, but you do not record the absence of threatening behavior. Why? The meeting room fell completely silent. One person opened his mouth, then closed it again. Another tapped the tip of a pen lightly against the table. The sound, small but sharp. Caleb looked around, realizing for the first time that the language Thath had protected him on the training yard no longer felt solid. He cleared his throat. If I don't close in, he said, I'll be evaluated as lacking decisiveness. He turned toward General Rock, seated at the opposite end of the table. Sir, that is what we are taught. Rock did not answer immediately. He looked at the screen, then at Elias, then at the instructors. And if you close in too much, he asked. Who takes responsibility? The question landed softly, yet made the entire room feel heavier. We take collective responsibility, one instructor replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The system takes responsibility. Elias nodded slowly. The system is not present there, he said. The person holding the gun is. He paused for a beat, and the person being aimed at is as well. Those words caused several people to lower their heads, not because they were fully convinced, but because they recognized how accustomed they had become to hiding behind the word system. The video froze again at the moment when the barrel pressed close to the head. The frame stood still. There was no laughter, no commands, only the image and the silence. An older supervising officer exhaled slowly. We called it control, he said, almost to himself. Perhaps we named it wrong. Caleb tightened his hands. I did nothing beyond what was permitted, he said quietly. If it was wrong, then it was wrong from the start. That statement, unintentionally, opened another door. Several gazes turned toward Elias. Yes, Elias replied, and that is why I am sitting here. He did not look at Caleb, but at the entire room, not to condemn a trainee, but to ask what it is that you are allowing. He paused, then reached into his jacket pocket. A faint metallic sound followed as Elias placed a small object onto the wooden table. It was an old item, its surface scratched, its dull metal catching the meeting room lights. No one spoke. Every eye was fixed on the object, as though it had just become the new center of the story. The meeting room remained silent, and in that silence, everyone understood that what had just been placed on the table was not merely a piece of metal, but a piece of evidence about to force the system to look directly at itself. The sound of metal tapping wood rang out softly yet clearly, enough to draw every bit of attention in the conference room to a single point. Elias Ward gently tapped the old Zippo against the tabletop, unhurried, without emphasis. "You all saw it," he said evenly, as if recalling a detail that seemed to have already passed. The screen at the front shifted scenes. Footage from the training field played in slow motion, each frame rendered sharply. In a very brief moment, the edge of Elias's jacket pocket slipped slightly open, a scratched line of metal flashing under the sun before disappearing. The frame froze at that exact point. No one bent down to look. No question was asked. The gun barrel appeared immediately afterward, fast and decisive. Elias tilted his head toward the screen. "I exposed it on purpose," he said, his tone unchanged, not to provoke, but to see who was still observing. The statement made a few people shift in their seats, as if they had just realized they were sitting in front of another test, one they had not prepared for. A young instructor frowned. "You set a trap?" he asked, irritation evident in his voice. "In training, we don't accept tricks." Elias nodded slowly. "A very small trap," he replied. "So small that only those who still keep the habit of observing would notice." He raised a hand toward the screen. "Someone doing the job properly would ask before pointing a gun." Caleb Harlan sprang up from his chair. "That was a harmless object," he said quickly, his voice sharp. "Anyone could see that. It wasn't a weapon." He glanced at General Rock, then back at Elias. "You can't use a harmless item to convict me." Elias turned to Caleb, his gaze direct. "Exactly," he said. "And you still press the gun." The reply was brief and final, requiring no further explanation. In that moment, the room seemed to contract, as if all other arguments were forced aside. The screen continued to play. The video slowed even further, magnifying every detail. Caleb's hand slid down toward the holster. The distance between the two men narrowed. There was no frame showing a question being asked about the object in the pocket. No annotation appeared noting any potential risk from the line of metal that had just flashed. A young supervising officer cleared his throat. "According to the criteria, we evaluate based on reaction," he said. "If the subject is uncooperative, increasing pressure is valid." "Pressure on whom?" Elias asked, turning toward him. "On the one holding the gun, or on the one standing in front of the barrel?" The question was not loud, but it made several people in the room lower their eyes to the table. An older instructor, who had objected from the beginning, exhaled sharply. "You're playing with words," he said. "We don't train people to stand there analyzing every glance. You train reflexes," Elias replied, "and every reflex has a blind spot." He tapped a finger lightly against the Zippo. "The moment power appears, many people stop observing. That is what's dangerous." Caleb clenched his hand. "I didn't stop observing," he said, his voice lower. "I watched behavior." He was silent, non-compliant. "Silence is not an act of aggression," Elias answered immediately, "and silence does not give you permission to skip verification." He looked straight at Caleb. "You chose the fastest option because you believed the system would stand behind you." Caleb shook his head. "If I hadn't done that, I would have been judged weak," he said. "I would have failed." He paused, then added, almost defensively, "I did what we were taught." General Rock placed both hands on the table, his voice deep. "And that is what we are discussing," he said. "What we teach, and what we score." He turned to the supervising officers. "Did any of you see that line of metal?" One of them shook his head. "We focused on distance and stance," he said. "We weren't instructed to record details like that." "Then who decides which details matter?" Elias asked. "The curriculum, or the person holding the pen?" He paused, letting the question hang in the room. The screen froze on the frame where the gun barrel pressed close to the head. There was no warning text, no note of threat, only the label of control. An older supervising officer murmured. "We call it control," he said, "because we need a word. Words don't cleanse actions," Elias replied. "They only make people more comfortable repeating them." He turned back to Caleb. "You're not wrong because you're cruel. You're wrong because you believed that once the procedure was followed, you no longer needed to look." Caleb let out a short, broken laugh. "You want me to apologize for doing the test correctly?" he asked. "You want me to stand up in front of the entire academy and say I was wrong?" Elias looked at Caleb for a beat longer. "I want you to understand," he said, "that in some moments, the right question is more valuable than the right command." He gestured toward the screen. A question was not asked here. The conference room fell silent, not from agreement, but because no one could easily dismiss it anymore. The instructors looked at one another. A few exchanged glances. A younger one spoke up hesitantly. "If we add observation as a criterion," he said, "we'll have to change how we score." Rock nodded. "Yes," he said, "and that's our job." He turned to Elias. "You put the Zippo on the table not to prove you were right." Elias shook his head slightly. "I put it there so you could see what you overlooked." Caleb sat back down, his shoulders sagging. He looked at the Zippo, then at the screen, then at Rock. "So what am I in this?" he asked quietly. "An example." Rock did not answer immediately. He looked around the room, at those accustomed to judging without being judged. "You are a result," he said, "of what we have treated as normal." Elias nodded faintly. "And because of that, the issue is no longer a single trainee." He paused, letting the words settle. Rock turned to the council, his voice firm. "The issue is no longer a single trainee." The statement was repeated, this time as an open conclusion, not closed, not placing blame on one individual. It pointed directly at the structure that had allowed that moment to occur. If you were the one scoring that day, would you call it control or threat? That question is not on the evaluation board, but it is there, in the conference room, between the battered Zippo and the cold lines of text on the screen. Leave your perspective, because the answer speaks not only about Caleb or Elias, but about how each person views power when it rests in their own hands. The meeting room was no longer a place to review an incident. It gradually turned into an operating table, where each layer of the curriculum was laid under cold light. Faces long accustomed to the role of evaluators now sat opposite the very criteria they had defended for many years. No one was talking anymore about a single moment on the training ground. The focus had shifted, slowly but decisively, from the individual to the structure. Elias Ward spoke up, without preamble. "Caleb is your product," he spoke calmly, not aiming at any one person in particular, his gaze sweeping across the entire table. "You taught that following the correct procedure is enough." The statement made several people shift in their seats. Others frowned, as if being forced to hear something they did not want to admit. An older instructor slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp and dry. "This is the military," he said, his voice high and harsh. "We train for fast action. We don't have time for moral lectures on the field." A few heads nodded, not forcefully, but enough to show that agreement was still there. Elias turned toward him, his expression unchanged. "Precisely because it is the military," he replied. "It cannot afford to be blind." The sentence was not loud, but it cut through the resistance with simple logic. A blind decision on the training ground can be scored. A blind decision out there cannot. He paused for a beat, and the consequences do not stop with the person holding the gun. Caleb Harlan sat still, his hands resting on his knees. He no longer argued the way he had before. For the first time since entering the meeting room, he realized that his name was being used as an example, not to convict him, but to point to a longer chain of causes. "I did what I was taught," he said quietly. "If it was wrong, then the lesson was wrong from the start." Another instructor shook his head. "You're avoiding responsibility," he said to Caleb, then turned to Elias. "And you're pushing it onto the system. No one here is innocent." "Correct," Elias replied. "No one is innocent." He looked directly at the man who had spoken. "But some people create the rules, some enforce them, and some are placed in front of the gun barrel." He lightly tapped the tabletop. "When things slide out of control, placing all the blame on the enforcer is the fastest way for the system to avoid examining itself." The air in the room thickened. The statements were no longer academic. They shared interests, habits, and the things that had allowed many people to advance. A younger instructor spoke up, his voice cautious. "If we admit there's a problem with the curriculum," he said, "we have to change the scoring system. And if we change the scoring system, many past evaluations will be called into question." "Exactly," General Rock said, cutting in for the first time, after a long silence. His voice was low and measured. "And that is what scares people." He looked around, avoiding everyone's gaze. "If we change, I will have the entire academy against me." The words landed not as a complaint, but as a weighed truth. Some people lowered their heads, others crossed their arms, their faces hardening. They understood well the cost of change in a system built on continuity and loyalty. Elias looked straight at Rock. "So, do you choose transparency or silence?" The question was not aggressive. It was posed like a crossroads. Transparency will be difficult, noisy, and will make many people angry. Silence will be calm, and will continue to produce moments like the one we just watched. Rock did not answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. The entire room waited. No one interrupted. This silence was different from the earlier ones. It was not the tension of confrontation, but the deliberation of power forced to question itself. Another instructor broke the silence. "What do you want us to do?" he asked Elias. "Rewrite the entire curriculum. Teach trainees to question every situation that isn't realistic." "No," Elias replied. "I want you to teach them to look." He spoke clearly. "Look before giving an order. Look before closing in. Look before raising a gun." He turned toward Caleb. "And teach them that there are moments when stopping for a single beat is the right decision." Caleb lifted his head. "If I had stopped that day," he said, his voice revealing a rare hesitation, "I would have lost points." The statement was not a defense, but more like a confession. "Then what is the system rewarding?" Elias asked in return, without waiting for an answer. "Speed or judgment?" An older instructor exhaled heavily. "We've trained this way for decades," he said. "It has produced effective soldiers." "Effective by what standard?" Elias replied. "By the number of situations resolved quickly, or by the number of situations that never required a gun." He paused. "What you measure is what you get." Rock raised his head. His expression was different now, no longer hesitant. "If we don't change," he said, "we will keep training people who believe that correct procedure is enough." He looked at Elias. "And if we do change, we will face resistance." Elias nodded. "Resistance is the cost of transparency," he said. "Silence is the cost of compromise." No one answered. The room fell into silence, but not the silence of avoidance. It felt like the moment before a decision is made, when every argument has been exhausted. Caleb looked down at his hands, realizing for the first time that the problem was not whether he had been right or wrong in a single exercise, but that he had been taught to believe he did not need to look beyond the score. Rock took a deep breath. The sound of it was clearly audible in the quiet room. He stood up slowly and placed both hands on the table. "We will reform," he said, not loudly, not dramatically. "We will review the curriculum, the scoring criteria, and the oversight process." He looked around, "and we will do it publicly." A few people reacted immediately. Chairs shifted. Whispers broke out. But Rock raised his hand, decisive. "This decision is not about assigning blame," he said. "It is about taking responsibility." Elias said nothing further. He sat still, his gaze softening slightly, like someone who had finally placed the right question in the right place. Caleb looked at Rock, then at Elias. He understood that from this moment on, nothing would return to the way it had been. The system had been named, and once a name is spoken, it can no longer pretend to be invisible. The decision to reform was made in heavy silence, with no applause and no enthusiastic agreement, but that very heaviness signaled that a door had opened, and that whatever would pass through it would no longer be as simple as an evaluation on a training ground. News of the reform decision spread faster than any official announcement. In just one night, the hallways of North Ridge changed tone. Posters appeared along the bulletin boards, on the doors of common rooms, in the corners of stairwells where trainees often gathered. The lettering was large and hurried, as if pasted up in anger. The slogans spoke of honor, of tradition, of refusing to let anyone stain the academy. No one signed their name, but everyone knew which group stood behind it. Whispers traveled with footsteps. "That old man humiliated the academy, an outsider coming in to teach us how to do our jobs. If we give in, who will respect North Ridge anymore?" The phrases were repeated often enough to become true in some people's minds. Tradition, something that rarely needed justification, was now being used as a shield for outrage. Caleb Harlan walked through that hallway, his eyes skimming over the sheets of paper. He did not stop, but his pace slowed. His name surfaced in conversations, in hushed remarks that gradually became more open. People sought him out, clapped him on the shoulder, nodded, spoke lines that sounded rehearsed. "They're on your side. You only did what you were taught. Don't let one old man ruin everything." At first, Caleb remained silent. The humiliation of the drill still weighed heavily on him, not yet settled. But each time he heard the story retold differently, each time he caught the sympathetic looks of those who had once respected him, his anger found something to cling to. He began to believe that he was not merely an individual who had made a mistake, but a victim of an imposed change. "They're on my side," Caleb said during a small gathering, his voice rough but firm. "They know I wasn't wrong." The statement was met with emphatic nods. In that moment, Caleb no longer felt isolated. He became a symbol of the fear of losing what was familiar, of the feeling that the effort of an entire generation was being dismissed. Elias Ward was in the small room temporarily assigned to him. Far from the trainee quarters, he knew what was happening without needing to be told. The averted gazes, the awkward greetings, the pauses when he passed by were enough to say it all. He did not react, nor did he try to explain. He understood that the counterstrike of tradition never came through rational debate, but through isolation. Night fell quickly and heavily. North Ridge after curfew sank into stillness, with only the sound of wind slipping through the buildings. A dry noise echoed in the hallway, then another. When Elias opened the door, the smell of paint hit him before he could see. Dark red spread across the door, running in streaks. The words emerged, crude and violent. "Go home, old man." Elias stood and looked. He did not step outside, nor did he reach for a rag. His gaze rested on each stroke of the letters, without anger and without sadness. To him, this was not a personal insult. It was a sign that the question he had raised had struck the right place. When a system cannot respond with argument, it retaliates with symbols and threats. The next morning, news of the door spread. A few trainees came by, stood at a distance, looked, then turned away. An instructor shook his head and murmured to a colleague that things had gone too far, but no one came to erase the words. They remained there all morning, like a warning displayed in public. Elias stepped outside and walked down the hallway with the paint-streaked door still behind him. He did not lower his head, nor did he look around. When he met General Rock at the stairwell, he spoke briefly. "I would like to address the entire class." Rock looked at him for a beat longer, then nodded. "This morning," he replied. The large auditorium quickly filled. Hundreds of trainees sat in rows, the atmosphere more tense than any debriefing. Some crossed their arms, faces cold. Others looked toward the podium with cautious curiosity. Caleb sat in the middle row, back straight, eyes fixed forward. He knew many eyes were on him, and the feeling both supported and bound him. Elias Ward stepped up to the podium. There was no long introduction, no prepared speech. He stood there, scanning the room, letting the silence set its own rhythm. The murmurs faded, then stopped completely. "You know who I am," Elias said, his voice low, needing no microphone. "And you also know why I am standing here." He paused, letting Hysia settle. "I did not come to apologize for asking a question." A few people stirred. Elias continued. "Tradition is what helps you stand firm when everything is in chaos. But when tradition is used to blind you, it will make you stumble." He did not accuse anyone directly, but everyone understood what the words were aimed at. Caleb shifted in his seat. He heard a few whispers behind him. "Did you hear that? He's lecturing us again." He clenched his jaw, but did not stand. Elias looked out over the room, his voice still even. "Last night, someone wrote on my door that I should go home." He did not need to elaborate. I looked at it, and I left it there. A few trainees glanced at one another, because it says more than any speech ever could. He took a slow step forward and placed his hand on the podium. "You are trained to react quickly. I understand that. But there are moments when what you need most is not speed, but a question." Elias paused, his gaze sweeping across the rows. That question was not asked on the training ground. The air in the auditorium was taut as a drawn wire. Some heads lowered, others lifted, eyes changing. Caleb looked toward the podium, feeling the focus shift. He realized that this confrontation was no longer between him and Elias, but between two understandings of honor. Elias reached into his coat pocket. The movement was slow, not startling. He placed a small object on the podium. Metal touched wood with a soft sound. An old Zippo lighter lay there, its surface scratched, its metallic sheen dull. The auditorium was silent. No one needed further explanation to understand that the small object was about to open a part of the story they had not yet fully heard. And in the moment that the Zippo rested on the podium before hundreds of trainees, everyone felt that the counterstrike of tradition had met something else. Not loud, not violent, but heavy enough to force everyone to look straight at it. The auditorium remained silent after the Zippo was placed on the lectern. No one urged anything forward. No one cleared their throat to break the rhythm. Rows of seats filled with young trainees sat motionless, as if any movement might cause something that had just been set before them to slip away. Elias Ward stood there for another beat, allowing the silence to complete its own work. "It is not the object in my pocket that is dangerous," he said, his voice low and clear. "What is dangerous is the moment you stop observing." He did not point at anyone, nor did he single out any row. The sentence went straight into the space, as if it belonged to everyone. Elias picked up the Zippo, turning it lightly in his hand. "This has been in my pocket for the entire evaluation," he continued. "It did not change. What changed was the way you looked when you believed you were holding power." He set the Zippo down again, this time more slowly, letting the sound of metal touching wood linger long enough. He raised his head. When the person in front of you does not resist, Elias asked, his voice neither raised nor pressing, what will you do with the power in your hands? The question was posed in full, without added explanation, without guidance. It stood there, bare, forcing those who heard it to confront themselves. No one answered. A few trainees shifted in their seats, then stopped. Others looked down at their own hands, as if seeing for the first time the familiar image of those hands in a different context. In the middle rows, Caleb Harlan lowered his head. He said nothing. For the first time since everything began, his silence was not defiance, but resembled an acknowledgement that something had gone beyond what he had been taught to respond to. Elias looked across the auditorium, his gaze not lingering long on anyone. I am not here to answer it for you, he said. I am only here to place that question in the right place. He paused for a beat. The rest is yours. General Rock stepped up beside the lectern. He did not interrupt Elias's words, simply stood there, like a quiet confirmation. The academy will change, Rock said, his voice deep. A new curriculum will be implemented. Evaluation criteria will add personal responsibility, observational ability, and ethical decision-making. He looked out over the auditorium, not to make you weaker, but to let you know when you do not need to be strong. A few whispers rose, not in protest, but in surprise. Rock raised his hand and continued. The new exercises will not allow hiding behind the words correct procedure. Every decision will have to be explained. He turned to Elias. You have said enough. Elias nodded. He did not seek applause. He did not look back behind him. I have done my part, he said. The rest is yours. He stepped back from the lectern, yielding the space to Rock. The talk ended without the familiar dismissal command. The trainees stood up slowly, one by one, as if they needed time to return to their old rhythm. Caleb stood up last. He looked toward the lectern, where the Zippo still lay. He hesitated, then turned away, saying nothing. In the days that followed, Northridge changed in a quiet way. Reform notices were posted on the bulletin boards, this time not torn down. A new curriculum was announced, adding sections that had previously existed only in side discussions. Exercises now forced trainees to stop, to explain, to question before acting. Some people objected, some accepted it, but no one could say they had not been warned. Elias Ward packed his belongings on a quiet morning. There was no farewell ceremony, no honor guard formation. He walked through the hallway where protest posters from before had been removed, leaving pale tape marks on the walls. He did not stop. Before leaving, Elias returned to the empty auditorium. He stepped up to the lectern one last time and placed the Zippo on the instructor's desk. He did not write a note. There was no need. That small object had said enough. When Elias left Northridge, no one ran after him. But in later training sessions, when a young trainee stood in a tense situation, when a hand touched the belt, someone paused for a beat, not out of fear of losing points, but because they remembered a question that had never come with a ready-made answer. The Zippo remained there, its metallic sheen dull under the lights. It did not ignite, but it did not go out. It stayed there, like a question whose flame never fully dies. Do you think violence can become clean simply because it is scored? That question does not need an immediate answer, but the way you think about it will follow you longer than any evaluation ever could. Leave your comment, and if you want to read more stories that force systems to examine themselves, follow along, because sometimes change begins with a very small question, asked at the right moment, and when the story closes, what remains is not gunfire, nor titles or scoreboards. It is the quiet question hanging in the air, about who holds power and what it is used for. Elias Ward left Northridge without carrying victory, because what he left behind was not a takedown, but a crack in the way people view correct procedure. From that moment on, every command, every decision, every glance before acting was no longer as innocent as before. If you find yourself pausing for a beat when you hear this story, if you ask yourself where the boundary between control and violence lies, then perhaps the story has touched the right place. Stories like this are not meant to give you ready-made answers, but to force us to look again at what is still considered normal. Follow and subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next parts, where each system and each familiar belief will be examined again through sharp and honest stories. And if you have thoughts of your own, leave a comment, because sometimes a perspective spoken at the right moment can change more than you think.